Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Welcome home to Torah. A very warm welcome home to Torah. Welcome back to the Yiboneh Beit Midrash. We are in Parshat Mishpatim. We're going to be dealing with chapter 21, verse 1. However, as a preamble or an introduction, I want to thank all of the listeners for participating now and when the recording goes up on YouTube. Also, if you're interested in the English sheets, you can email me. There is a link down below with my email address. The Hebrew sheets are also available, which we encourage you to use. Learn Hebrew. You won't get the color-coded copy like I have, but you will still have access to the Hebrew. Now, if you do want the English source sheets, I already mentioned that, you can email me. Down below, you'll also be able to pick up links to previous classes, meaning specifically links to this class, meaning this Parsha, Mishpatim, but you can also access the website and pick up any class with any topic on any of the other Parshiot. Just as a reminder, we discussed the fundamentals here. Absolutely fundamental to understand these truths, these eternal truths from time immemorial, and it's another reason to follow the Hebrew source sheets. And one more, I'm going to call it a disclaimer, and that is this Parshat Mishpatim, there's no coincidence that it falls out this week where the Supreme Court, or let's just say the whole reform of the justice system is being discussed. There's no question that many of the shirim that I gave on Mishpatim are worthwhile listening to and have to deal with, they actually do deal with the choosing of the Shoftim, of the judges, which you actually see in Parshat Shoftim as well. But here, it's a great introduction to the idea of who's fit, what kind of people you want, and what the judges themselves, how they should act, mitnaheg, how they should conduct themselves and behave. So that's really, in a nutshell, one of the ideas we're talking about, and there's no coincidence that this week in particular. I remember Rav Nevin Sol, the Rav of the Rova, should live long and be well, and discuss the idea in yeshiva, when you're sitting and learning Torah, you are not just reading the news. Don't read the news. Make the news. Okay? Meaning chadashot, make a chidush, make and come to these novel ideas within the Torah. Learn the Torah like it's better than the newspaper. It's actually revealing, it's revelatory about what is going on in the world, within yourself, and so the micro as well as the macro, and it usually keeps up to date with whatever's going on in the world. So our verse, chapter 21, verse 1, I'll read it in English and then the Hebrew. And these are the ordinances that you shall place before them. Okay, so there's a lot of civil laws, but this first verse starts with a vav. A vav is one of two kinds, right? It acts in two different ways. Either it's a vav hamachaber, a vav that connects what was previous to what is now being said, or it could be a vav hafuch, which means a inversal vav, which takes a verb and changes the tense from past to present or present to past. So we're going to see Rashi says, va'ela, what does ela mean? And what does it mean, va'ela? What would it be with a vav? What would it be without a vav? Truth be told, that's going to be the first Rashi, so we might as well see it. So Rashi says, and these are the ordinances. Did I read? Okay, the Hebrew. Va'ela hamishpatim esher tasim lifnehem. These are the ordinances or the laws which you shall place before them. You're commanded, this is a command to put before them. Who's them? The people? Perhaps. The judges? More likely, but okay. Because if it's a vav hamachaber, it means it's taking what was previously said. There's a lesson to be taught, and that lesson must be taught as well to whoever these ordinances are being placed in front of as well. That's the short of it. So Rashi says, what does it mean, Ela, without the Vav? If it was just Ela without the Vav, Rashi says, Kol makom shenemar Ela, it's pasal et harishonim. You're excluding what was said previously. It's like saying the word but or however. And then there's a different truism. But if it's va'ela with a vav, it's moisif al harishona. Then it comes to add over and above what was just previously said. Our verse says va'ela and these ordinances. So that's key. Now, the rest of that Rashi wants to explain why is it, what was said previously, which is going to be important to know. All you have to do is go back to the last sentence of last week's Parsha, meaning chapter 20, verse 23. You shall not ascend my altar on steps, so that your nakedness will not be uncovered upon it. This is very strange, first of all, because for sure this says my altar. And therefore, God wants a ramp to be built instead of steps. Now, the verse itself says, so your nakedness will not be uncovered upon it. What kind of nakedness? First of all, there was a tunic that the Kohanim wore, right? And underneath the tunic were michnesei bad, some type of, I'm going to call them long johns, some kind of, it's not an underwear, it's an underpant. The underpant being pants that were worn underneath this tunic. So what kind of nakedness is or shall not be uncovered upon it? This is going to be key. Also, the verse seems to be talking about whom? Kohanim, because they're the only ones that are walking up this particular ramp. Okay, so Rashi on our verse actually mentions that what was previously said is now repeated again, or let's just say emphasized again, just as had been previously stated in Parshat Yisro, the 10 Commandments. That was like the big finale, right? The big kahuna was the revelation at Mount Sinai, but also, as you saw, the altar was mentioned, the building the altar from earth, and or putting the earth within the altar, so it was as if it was built from soil. That was said at Sinai. So too, Ele Mishpatim, these laws, these civil laws, all these torts, all these laws between man and fellow man are also from Mount Sinai. Very important lesson. Now Rashi continues why, and this is really what the Yakar is going to quote Rashi saying. Keep in mind that Rashi brings here this exact statement. Why is this section dealing with the laws in Mishpatim juxtaposed? There's a smichut to the section dealing with the altar, meaning it follows at least in chronological order, some kind of order. And the answer that Rashi gives, which is from the Oral Torah, from the Mechilta, to teach you, to tell you that we must place the Sanhedrin. Who's the Sanhedrin? That is the Supreme Court. Those are the judges. Adjacent to, now there's different editions, some say the Beit HaMikdash, some say the altar, Etzel HaMizbeach, right next to the Mizbeach, next to the altar itself. Okay, now, that is Rashi here. I do want to go back to the Rashi on the last verse we read in last week's Parsha, which is chapter 20, verse 23, number 4 in the English source sheet. So it says, you shall not ascend with steps my altar. V'lo ta'aleh b'ma'alot al mizbachi. Don't go up in ascension. Ma'alot is an ascension. In fact, that's in Old French, as Rashi will quote. That's what it means. Al mizbachi. And then the rest of the verse says, Asher lo tigale irvatcha alav, which you should not reveal this nakedness, your nakedness upon it. Very strange, as we already mentioned, that there are pants underneath this skirt-like tunic. So what kind of nakedness could we be talking about? Also, these are Kohanim, not judges. Very important. Rashi says that when you build the ramp for the altar, don't make it with steps, but echelons. Echelon is like a higher level, or steps, but rather it must be smooth and slanting, meaning on a shipua, on some type of a ramp. Now, right away, Rashi mentions, so your nakedness shall not be exposed. He brings up what I mentioned, because due to the steps, Well, actually, he prefaces it with this. Due to the steps, what you would end up doing was taking, separating your feet further. He uses the word strides, which is interesting. You're widening the strides. Widening the strides is close to exposing nakedness of one ascending steps. And now this is where we're going to get into this idea, like, what are you talking about? Steps and what nakedness? That you have toward, or you behave toward, the stones. These are stones. Stones are inanimate objects. What do I care if when I separate my legs further because I'm walking up a step, that my underneath is going to be shown, which it isn't, by the way, but as if it was, to these inanimate objects, stones. And not only that, there is no nakedness. In Exodus chapter 28:42, it says, there is no nakedness. And Rashi says, there is no actual nakedness because it says you shall make them linen pants. Nevertheless, one should not behave towards these steps, which are inanimate objects, in a humiliating manner. What is so humiliating to a stone about looking up a skirt, which anyway you have pants on? This is mind-boggling. And if you're not bothered by this, I mean, you could just turn it off right now, but okay. So it's very interesting. So Rashi actually starts to begin to give an explanation, this will become familiar once we read the Yakar. Now these matters are called a kal v'chomer. A kal v'chomer is the efaturi argument, meaning there's a logical conclusion. That if these stones, which have no intelligence, no das, to object to their own humiliation, which obviously they're not being humiliated, but if they would have been, and they are inanimate objects, and they can't do anything about it, meaning they don't even have the sense to do anything about it. They're not really embarrassed. But if they were, they would be embarrassed. So the Torah says this whole idea is necessary to teach. You should not behave towards these inanimate objects, in a humiliating manner. Now, that's by inanimate objects, and if that's true, how much more so? Kal v'chomer. If that's true by something light, how much it must be true by something severe? How about to your friend, your fellow human being, who's created in the likeness of your Creator, who does actually object? He's not an inanimate object, or she is not an inanimate object. They could be humiliated, so how much more you have to be careful not to humiliate them. Okay, so far, all we read was, these two verses, the Rashis as well, and let's go head over heels, dive deep down into the Yakar. So the Yakar immediately asks on the Hebrew sheet, Lama nismecha parshas dinim leparshas mizbeach. Why is, and he's quoting Rashi, why is there this juxtaposition, this close proximity to the law of dinim? Dinim are civil laws. To the parsha next to the mizbeach. And by the way, this is very interesting because Bnei Noach are obligated in dinim. And if that's true, then what I'm telling here, what we're learning here, they should also understand on a very, ethical, mystical, metaphysical level, there's important wisdom to glean from these lessons as well. So why is it that the laws of torts, dinim, civil laws, are next to the altar? Because that's our chapter 21, next to the last verse of chapter 20. To teach you, shetasim hasenhedrin etzel mizbeach. Yes, even Bnei Noach, all people of the world would listen to the Sanhedrin, because the Sanhedrin would rule in not just Jewish law, but also world law, especially after Mashiach comes. Kach perish Rashi. This is Rashi's explanation. Now what the Yakar is going to do is bring in a Gemara from Sanhedrin that Rashi didn't bring. Well, he kind of did in last week's Parsha when we deal with the altar. But interesting enough, here's how the Gemara goes. So if you look in the English source sheet number 2, I'm not going to read it, I'm going to read the Hebrew, but you'll see it in the English if you want. It says like this, Darash bar kapara. Darash doesn't mean just taught, but it means expounded. It's not really clearly in the text. It's you expound the text, and you can draw it out of the text. And the question is like this: Manaha milsa da'amar rabbanan. Where in the world did the rabbis come up with this fundamental principle? You can find this in Pirkei Avot, by the way. It's in very, very beginning, chapter 1, Mishnah 1 in Pirkei Avot. Do I have it here on this source sheet? I did not bring it. Maybe I did. Okay, I didn't, but you can see any Pirkei Avot would have it. Havu matunim midin means that one should be slow and deliberate or moderate in judgment. Obviously, especially talking to judges. Now I'm going to show you how far it goes when it comes to judges. And we should apply this to our own lives because we do judge constantly all the time. That when there is a guilty verdict, one should not come to the conclusion and voice his verdict right away. When the Sanhedrin or the Beis Din is thinking that, you know what, the guy's probably innocent, everything looks like it's going in that direction, then we should quickly conclude. Let's really hash it out now and declare him innocent so you can go. A lot of negative consequences can happen by spending one night in jail, besides what can happen to the prisoner in jail. But people say, oh, he was arrested, he must be guilty. But if he's exonerated quite rapidly, so you can save a lot of damage from somebody, from happening to somebody. But if one is actually, the Beis Din is leaning toward guilt, and especially we're talking about life and death cases where the consequences are so grave that it's better to give the verdict. In fact, you're obligated as a judge, as a group of judges, to wait till the next day to announce the verdict. Why? Well, first of all, maybe exculpatory, that's how you pronounce it, evidence will come in, evidence that will prove his innocence. And so therefore, because if you declared him guilty today, you'd have to kill him, right, if it was a capital crime. But if it's a guilty verdict coming up, and everyone's pretty much, I say everybody, the majority is leaning in that direction, better to delay, especially delay, take your time. And that's what it's referring to. So now, according to Bar Kapara, he's telling you that there is a drasha, you can expound the verse to get this concept that the rabbis speak about from lo ta'aleh b'ma'alot. Last week's Parshat, don't ascend my altar with steps. Okay, we'll have to discuss that. V'samich le, Bar Kapara explains, it's because of the juxtaposition, ve'ela ha-mishpatim, and these are the judgments we shall put before them. Now, the same Gemara in Sanhedrin 7b explains the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, but it doesn't use the word darash. It uses the word omer, which is a clear-cut statement. It's not expounding. Perhaps it's closer to pshat, to the simple explanation of the verse, although I don't see it being the simple explanation of the verse right away. We'll have to work it out. So he says, Minayin ledayan shelo yapsia al rashei am kodesh. From where do we know that a judge should not trample? The word yapsia means to walk upon the heads of the holy nation. And it's the same smichut, the same juxtaposition of the following verse, lo ta'aleh b'ma'alos, don't ascend steps. Okay, now, and it's v'samich le ve'ela mishpatim. The close proximity is to the following verse, which is the first verse of our Parsha. This is the Gemara. Rashi does not bring the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, nor the drasha of Bar Kapara. He does bring this important idea that that's where the Sanhedrin sits, next to the Mizbeach. So the Yakar wants to know. Umida hizkir lashon darash. Notice, there is a mentioning of this expounding, darash, etzel, next to or in relation to the words of Bar Kapara. Now, when it came to the words of Rabbi Elazar, ve'etzel divrei Rabbi Elazar, lo hizkir darash, which means what? Shma Mina, I'll tell you what it means, he says. Shma Mina means we reduce from here. Divrei bar kapara, heim derek darash ba'ama, that bar kapara must be just stamazoi, a very simple drasha, which means it's not clear in the verse. By the way, I'm sure you know this, the pardes, when we enter the Torah, we're walking into the orchard of God. When I think of orchard, I think of the Garden of Eden. And so there's pardes, pei, reish, samech, samech, pardes, pshat, remez, drush, sod. We enter different levels of understanding, the simple understanding, then the hints, then the expounding, and then the secrets, the deep secrets of the Torah itself is embedded in the word pardes. Pardes, you could say that means like an orchard, but really it sounds like paradise. You want to enter paradise? Then take the layers of the Torah like an onion, peeling an onion. It's getting to the root. It's really amazing. So, where do we stop? Shema Mina, this is what we can hear from it. Fine. So therefore, when the verse said, Lo ta'aleh b'ma'alos, don't ascend these steps, pshuto medaber b'mizbeach. There's no question that we were talking about the mizbeach. Everyone agrees with that, but dayani man dachashmam. But when it comes to the idea of judges, the judges aren't even mentioned there. In fact, we would think we're talking about Kohanim because they're the ones that ascend the steps on the altar. I'm sorry, the ramp on the altar. Aval divrei Rabbi Elazar einam daresh. He's rehashing this idea. If it's not a drasha, then what is it? It's pshuto shel pasuk. It's the simple explanation of the verse. And the simple explanation of the verse is Lo ta'aleh b'malos al mizbachi. Do not ascend steps onto my altar. Anu lemedin sheperusho shelo lipsoa al rosh kodesh. And as a result of that, according to Rabbi Elazar, we simply learn the simple pshat, not to walk on the heads of the holy people. So basically, on a certain level, I'm looking for the Rashi that does say it. I don't have it in front of me, but I'm sure it's here somewhere. Basically, there's a thing called a metargaman. I do have it. If you actually look on page 1, number 2, which is the quote from the Gemara, Sanhedrin 7b, on the bottom right, there's a Rashi print. That's Rashi on the Gemara. And Rashi on the Gemara says when it comes to these ma'alot, these are steps, what's the problem with walking up the steps? B'chazaka u'b'merutza. He says you walk with a lot of force and you go quickly. Keep that in mind. But this is what I wanted to show you. Aroshe am kodesh. Rashi says on the Gemara there, what does it mean you're going over the heads or upon the heads, trampling the heads of the holy people? So Rashi says, Kishohaya hamaturgaman. So when you had this interpreter, now I'm not sure it was actually an interpreter, but someone like this was like a loudspeaker system. So if you had rows and rows of people, so those who were sitting next to the speaker heard what he said. But people who were beyond the 10 or 15 row mark couldn't hear so well. So the Matargaman would get up and repeat what he heard to the next group of 15 rows. Then there was another Matargaman who would then go and repeat what he heard. So Rashi explains, when you had the Targaman, he was Darish, Hayu Hatzibur Yoshvin La'aretz, that the congregation, whoever was sitting and listening, whether it was a Sanhedrin or a rabbi giving a speech, they would be sitting on the earth, on the ground. V'hamapsiya beinehem, this Matargaman would walk amongst them, Lelek uliyeshev b'makomo, and he would either walk around and then he would end up sitting in his place, but nira kimapsiya al roshan. But from a side angle, not a bird's eye angle, but a horizontal angle, it would look like he's walking on their heads. Now that's just appearances. Anyway, I do want to read this last Rashi on the Gemara, on the Sanhedrin 7b. He says, V'samik lei ve'el Mishpatim. Both agreed, Rabbi Elazar as well as Bar Kapara, that there's a smichut, there is this close proximity to the idea of don't walk up steps, but rather a ramp. 2, these are these laws you should put in front of them. Kolomar af l'shoftim ani mazhir. Rashi says this is a command, a warning to whom? To the shoftim. This will give you a little idea how Rashi brought in the idea. It's the Sanhedrin that's sitting there. Shoftim are the judges. But it was important to show you that middle Rashi about what it meant to walk on the heads of the people. So, here we go. We just said, Anu lemedim shepei rusho shelo lipso al roshem kodesh kederek sheperish Rashi, just like Rashi explains. And Rashi does explain in the previous verse, Harei devarim kal v'chomer. This is a eifutori argument, meaning it's one of the 13 hermeneutical principles, by the way. It's a logical argument or logical conclusion. And if that's true, by the way, the Rabbeinu Nisim says that all Bnei Noach are obligated not just in 7 laws, but even beyond. Any law that is logical or ethical. And that's the name of Rabbeinu Nisim. So this is logic. Ma avanim she'im behem das lahakpid al bizyonam. We saw this already in the English translation. Just like the stones, which are inanimate objects, they don't have the mind to be concerned about humiliation. Nevertheless, what does the Torah tell you? Lo ta'aleh b'malos. Don't build steps, but rather a ramp. They should not go up steps, meaning quickly or hurriedly or forcefully. Lo titnaheg behem derek bizayon. Don't behave with them, meaning with the people, in a derek bizayon. As a judge, we all know that there's such a thing as contempt of court. Contempt of court probably works well when there's a clear violation, but sometimes judges get a little bit carried away, and if you look at the wrong way, right, you pick your nose in court, they might hold you of contempt of court and throw you out. So don't behave with them, with the people. We're talking about stones. Don't behave with the stones, even though they don't have the mind to be humiliated. Nevertheless, what happens when it comes to your friend and your fellow human being? Shu b'demus yitzircha. He is created in the image of God. He is in the image of your Creator. Umakpid al bizyono, and he is concerned about humiliation. Al achas kama v'kama. How much more so do you need to be concerned about his or her being humiliated? Lefizeh, so according to this, below shum darush anu lemedim, that it's not necessary a drasha that we're actually learning out. Don't psia al roshem kodesh. It's not a drasha, like a hint or an expounding of the verse, but rather it's a logical conclusion. Kal v'chomer min ha'avanim. You actually come to this conclusion based on the fact that these inanimate objects, the Torah says, do not reveal your nakedness upon the ramp, the stones. Okay, the next paragraph begins like this. Mikol makom, nevertheless, Tzarich Rebbe Elazar Gam Elasmichu Taparshiot. Not just Rebbe Elazar, both of them. Bar Kapara needs it for his drasha, but even for what we're going to call the logical argument. You still need one verse following the other with the vav, and these. And these is dragging it. It's pulling it, what had been said previously, to what is about to be said. That's what we said the word and means. Ki below hasmichut hayiti oimer. Now, if you didn't have a smichut, you didn't have this juxtaposition. Maybe you had a space, maybe you had other words. Whatever it is, the very fact that one verse abuts, is adjacent to and connected to, in a certain sense, the following verse, she'enu dayin chashuv. What would some say? Sorry. That's dafka adam acher. Remember, we said this is talking about who? The Kohanim. So you might be thinking this is talking about someone else, not the judge. She'enu dayan v'chashuv. Oh no, we're not talking about someone who's very important and has such an important job as being on the court. Lo yapsia rosham kodesh derek bizayon. Okay, so they're the people, they're just the regular lower people. They are the ones who shouldn't walk on the heads of other people to humiliate them. The kal v'chomer min ha'avanim, as we were taught, right? This kal v'chomer from the stones, because we already saw that tzivoy. There's a command: lo taleh b'malos, don't walk up steps. Hu l'stam kohanim she'enam dayanim. This verse must only be talking about what? Kohanim, because they're the ones that go up the ramp. Aval hadayin, this is all what you might think. Okay, but it's mistaken. But the dayan, you might think, shetzarich laha til ema ala tzibor. You might think that it's actually proper and necessary for the judge to place some kind of fear on the people. Kadesh yu devarav nishmaim, in order for his words to be heard. No, I'm going to tell you the truth. This is not the case. We're going to see it's not the case. But you imagine if a judge is really very good at what he does or she does, you don't need to scream, right? They don't have to throw people out for contempt of court, because people will have a natural awe and respect for such a judge. But if the judge is placing this undue fear on the people just so they should hear him and be heard, so you might mistakenly think that he's allowed or she's allowed, this judge, because they need the respect. V'shema tomar, then maybe you actually will conclude, and this is like today's political problem, shemalas hashofet gedolim min malas hakohen. You might even conclude what? It's almost laughable that the attributes, right, the virtues of being a shofet, of being a judge, would be greater than being a kohen. Now there's a statement in Aramaic, V'dayo liba min hadin liyot kenidon, which basically is talking about how the kal v'chomer is supposed to work. Whatever new thing we're deriving out can never be more than the original. I mean, the principles have to still be the same. Kamash malan, therefore you need the smichut. Therefore comes the smichut to teach me Vela Mishpatim asher tasim lifneim, that whatever we just said before, which is really, yes, concerning the Kohanim, it's only, you can only realize that it's talking about the Sanhedrin or the judges because of the smichut. Va'ela, and these, what I just told you about the Kohanim, they also apply to the judges. Meaning to say, Ratzol Amar, Otan Mishpatim Shenizkaru Lamala, those very laws that I spoke to you, I, God, spoke to you about how to build the altar with a ramp. True, it's for the Kohanim. Okay, but don't think it only applies to them. The Eila Mishpatim, it also comes. But anyway, let's continue. Those laws that I mentioned above, they come as a kal v'chomer from the stones, meaning that the stones are inanimate objects and you have to not humiliate them. So surely you can't humiliate the people as well. Shelo lipsoa roshem kodesh tasim gam lifneim. This you have to give to the judges. The judges cannot be in this position where they think they can just trample on people. Hainu lifnei dayanim. Put these laws. They have to know as well that they should not humiliate the people. Shalomar shagam hadayinu biklal kal v'chomer zeh. That the dayanim, whatever is from the Eila Mishpatim onward, this also applies. Whatever applied above, when I say above, the previous verse to the Kohanim applies to the dayanim. Now, the Yakar continues. V'das kapara lidrosh pasuk. Right? The das kapara, according to the opinion of Bar Kapara, he was able to expound the verse being lo ta'aleh b'malos, don't ascend steps, but we said it was derek durashed, by way of expounding. Shehadayin tzarich liyot matun bedin. His opinion was, this is where the rabbis know this important lesson, that when the judges judge, they should be deliberate and deliberate, right, for a long time, and go slowly in their judgment. The Yakar says, Udvarav muchusarim biur, that their own words are lacking clarity. In other words, they need clarification. And the question he asked is, Ma inyan Kimayina malos elamitun. What exactly does steps have to do with going slowly? Now I have to admit, the example he's going to give is a little bit hard for me to imagine, except when I was a kid. Okay, so in other words, but let's hear what he says. Even though Rashi did make an effort to try to fix this understanding, because he says, at least in the Gemara, right, and he said and actually said in the Chumash as well, when it says steps, ma'alot, hainu b'merutza. You know what? We can even think about ascension. You know, I deal with converts, I deal with Bnei Noach, I deal with, just students in general, Jewish students. You know, when you want to take on something new, a new minhag, you have to go slow. Think it well, learn it first. Learn more about what you're about to do before you just make a snap decision and say, I want to ascend, so I'm going to start doing additional stuff. Slow down, learn it first, learn it well. So, b'malos, we already said that means ascension. And what does that mean? Hainu b'merutza. Well, we're talking about steps. Apparently, this is the way the Yakar explains it. Because he says, I don't really get Rashi's explanation. How does ma'alot have to do with ascension, going quickly? Ki ha'oile lamala holek la'at la'at. Because when you go up steps, you go slowly, slowly. At least if we're talking about real steps, I'll tell you the truth. I go, as I get older, when I go down steps, I go slower down steps than I used to. And going up steps, I still may skip a step. You go up steps, you kind of want to get there. But anyway, Rashi says, and I guess when we were kids, he says, so at least let's say, relatively speaking, going up is slower than going down. When you go down, you go quickly. Like I said, when I was a kid, I remember jumping downstairs. I never really jumped up steps. I would climb two at a time. But when I went down, I went much quicker, I think. But anyway, I think as you get older, it's the opposite. But we have to understand what Rashi's trying to say, at least from that perspective. Hakarov Elai Lomar. So Rashi says, Yakar says, this is how I see it. Shekak Perusha. This is really the pshat. Forget the running up and the going down and what's quicker and what's not quicker. He says, Kikol Dayan Sheno Dan B'mitun Hu Mitzad Gasus Rucho. That any judge who is not slow in his judgment, right? Let's say you go to a judge and he's so quick, or you go to a rabbi and you're asking him to judge on something and he doesn't ask you questions. He doesn't take time to think about it. He doesn't pull the book off the shelf and look it up. He is arrogant and haughty. That's what gasut rucho. It means coarse of spirit. But as you'll see, he's talking about someone with a certain sense of arrogance. Shurotze, we're now turning the page. Laharos l'kol adam ki hu baki bedinim v'yodea lidmus milsa lemilsa. It sounds from here what the person is doing, and I can relate to it as a very new young rabbi or studying to be a rabbi. I wanted to show that I knew what I was thinking or talking about, and I was still in early places of development. But nevertheless, I might have been quick to open my mouth. But the person wants to show that he's an expert in civil law, in judging, and that he knows how to make comparisons, right, to one thing to another, to come to a logical or possible correct conclusion. Ugavoa apo, and actually turn up his nose. Bal yidrosh me'al sefer tochen adin, and not go back and refer to the books or his own notes or anything. He'll be quick. He wants to show off. Right? It's all about gaiva and arrogance and haughtiness. So what comes out from this? Sheze'eno dan b'mitun. That means the person is not judging deliberately. He's not giving a well thought out, slow, processed verdict, but rather hu ole b'ma'alos derek ge'ah v'ga'on. But rather he's ascending these steps in way of haughtiness and self-exaltedness And this is what Rashi is explaining according to the Kli Yakar b'marutza. Forget this trying to figure out, do I walk up steps faster or do I go down steps faster? Okay, but rather it's not talking about that at all. It's talking about going through the steps within your mind, right? Coming to the end conclusion without really thinking it through. B'marutza. Ki ad mehera yarutz devarav lichto chadin. Meaning he is actually going very quickly, meaning in a running fashion, to give a verdict. Chote chadin, that's the grammar, that's the phraseology that Chazal use when you cut the verdict. You're cutting the din. Shehu gas libo b'hora. It's an exalted way of giving instructions, of trying to be a rabbi, of trying to be a teacher. You know, you have to really think this through, and I'm learning a lot. Telling my students, wow, first of all, it gives me time to think even about the correct answer I want to give them. Wow, that was a really thoughtful question. And it usually is. But that allows me, how much time did I buy? I already bought a few seconds to think about what I'm going to say. Okay, that's first of all. But wait till you hear this. King David, Psalm 75, verse 3. Now what you're going to do, it's going to be on page 3, number 6, and we're going to read 7 together. In 75:3, Psalms, when I take, I don't like the English, but in Pshat, that's what it means, a moed. Ki ekach moed. When I take, what is a moed here is talking about either Shabbos or Yontif, right? A holiday. We're not going to do any work on the holidays. You actually have time to think. So, but really, moed means an appointed time or time itself. And when I take time, the rest of the verse, ani meisharim eshpot, I shall judge with fairness. So when I, as the judge, am given time to think, I will most likely come out with a fair and proper judgment than if I just quickly rattle off a bunch of answers. But wait to hear this. The Kli Yakar brings in the next verse. Well, let me just read the Kli Yakar on that verse. He says, Dafke bizman she'ekach li zman moed. It's specifically taking time. That's how you understand the verse. I'm taking time. Then, listen to this in 73:21, Psalms. When my heart is in ferment. Now in Hebrew, ki yit chametz livavi. What's chametz? Chametz is we don't eat it on Pesach. That's where the water hit the flour and it just sat there. See, if you rolled it and molded it and worked the flour, it'll never turn into chametz. Okay, so anyway, we're makpid anyway for 18 minutes, but let's just say that the fermentation is where you're just allowing it to sit and do nothing. So when my heart is in this state of, I'm going to call it contemplation, you'll see because of the next part of the verse. When my heart is in ferment, it's not trying to develop new ideas, it's just reviewing. In fact, that's the halach on Shabbat. You really shouldn't spend too much time learning new stuff on Shabbat. You should spend Shabbat reviewing what you did the whole week. Really, we'll call it processing. You need time to process what you learn. Anyway, when my heart was in ferment, which in Hebrew says, Ki yitchametz levavi, what's the rest of the verse? It's unbelievable. Ukilyotai eshtonan, which in the English here it says, though my mind was sharpened. Why my mind? Kilyotai are talking about my kidneys. That's where my mind is? Yeah. The kidneys are that organ, that part of your body, it works as a filter, right? In the physical world, in the physical reality, it acts as a filter. Now, more than that, it's the seat of your advice, the counsel. This is like deep thought is made there. And therefore, we're going to call it your mind. My mind becomes sharpened. When I allow the thoughts to ferment, we're not talking about anything bad. Only on Pesach is fermentation negative, right? But all year round, to really mitun bedin, be deliberate in judgment and take your time is a good thing. We judge people all the time. There's no question about it. That's why there's a mitzvah. One of the mitzvahs is to judge your fellow favorably. Meaning, yes, you're going to judge them, so you might as well judge them favorably. And that's a great exercise and a lot of work. And that is the work of serving Hashem, of working out your own personal judgments, hopefully in the correct fashion. Okay, so now we're in the next paragraph. The al kol panim kosher li Rashi. The Kli Yakar is still bothered. Something about Rashi. And I'll tell you what it is. Simply what I think I mentioned earlier. That Rashi only mentions about the smichut, the close proximity to not going up the altar, the idea of the altar, and Elo Mishpatim, this is where the Sanhedrin sits. That's the only pshat Rashi brings on that verse. So the Kli Yakar wants to know, so what does he think about what it says in the Gemara? Those two rabbis, Bar Kapara and Rebbe Elazar, both brought down these opinions. That one, Bar Kapara was a Darash, Havim Matunim Ladin, this is where the rabbis understand, slow in judgment, and Rebbe Elazar, that you should not walk on the heads of the holy people. In other words, don't humiliate, a judge should not humiliate people. Okay, so Al Kol Panim Kosher li Rashi. So the Kli Yakar is still bothered. Something about Rashi doesn't sit right. Sheperish smichot parshiot. He says that he explains that the close proximity between these two paragraphs, bo laharos shetasim Sanhedrin etzel mizbeach, that it's clearly coming to teach that one should put the Sanhedrin, that's where the Sanhedrin sat, on the Temple Mount, in one of the rooms of the courtyard surrounding the altar. Manale Rashi lomer kach. The Kli Yakar asks, where does Rashi get such a thing? I'm sorry. The Kli Yakar asks, where does Rashi get this? Shema hasmichus asi lekadarish bar kapara o ledivrei Rebbe Elazar. It's just a simple question the Kli Yakar is asking. Maybe the juxtaposition is coming from one of those two opinions brought in the Gemara. Mara Rashi, so what exactly did Rashi see? Meaning, what did he understand? Al kakalasos perishlishi, to bring an entirely different opinion, a third opinion. And the hishmit osan, hishmit, like shmita, to release, and he left out those two perushim shenizkaru b'gemara. He totally left out in that on that verse. Al kain nira lefarish. Therefore, the Kli Yakar says, this is how I see it. That Bar Kapara and Rebbe Elazar shneim sovrin. This is what they were thinking. This is how they held. This is what they reasoned. Shema shneimar, from the very fact that it says lo ta'aleh b'ma'alos al mizbachi. What does the word al mean? This is where the Kli Yakar is now going to enter a little bit. Well, we're here to learn Hebrew also. The word al literally means upon. Could it really mean upon the Mizbeach? Don't ascend the steps upon my altar, which we've been thinking that's what it means the whole time. But the Kli Yakar explains the word, the milat al, has two definitions. See, milat al yesh lo shnei perushim. There's two ways to explain that word. Hain, one way is al mamash, yes, upon, in a real sense. Vupshuto shomikra, and that could be, and in fact it certainly is, the simple explanation of the verse. But there's another way to look at Hain lashon etzel, that it actually means next to. Now, once we get into this other idea of next to, that's going to help us understand a lot. And he gives an example. And we actually went through it quickly in the Rashi, but in chapter 20, verse 21, which is actually on the same, right? It says, an altar of earth shall you make for me, you shall slaughter near it your elevation offerings and your peace offerings, your flock, your herd. Wherever I permit my name to be mentioned, I shall come to you and bless you. Nobody slaughters animals on the Mizbeach. They're slaughtered below, in the courtyard. The blood is then spilled on the Mizbeach, and there are limbs that are brought on top of the Mizbeach, but that's only after it's slaughtered. Everybody knows the slaughtering process is not on the Mizbeach. So in the Hebrew over there, it actually says, V'zavachta olav, you shall slaughter on it. Perish Rashi there says, etzlo, next to it. Everybody knows you slaughter next to it. Not only that, how else do we know that al really means next to? From Numbers chapter 2, verse 20, where the different arrangements of the tribes, who is next to who. And it mentions over there, olav mate Menashe, that a certain tribe is next to Menashe. Obviously, they're not sitting on their heads of Menashe, right? The tribes are 3 on each of the 4 sides. You got 12 tribes. It was a beautiful arrangement with flags and people. But guess what? The Hebrew sounds like, if you thought alav, because al is the root, upon them is mate Menashe. It cannot possibly mean on top of. So this is like proof text that al means next to. Now, based on that, Yilam me tachton me elyon. Now, this is an interesting statement. The statement is, what we do is we learn from what is below. We learn about what is below from what is above. So you have a paragraph, and what is below in the paragraph, or let's say a book, is you can learn from what was above. If something was stated above that meant al, right, we're going to see that was verse 21, about not slaughtering on the altar but next to the altar. So too here, in our verse, when we're saying don't ascend steps upon the altar, the word al is also next to. And we're getting to the idea of the Sanhedrin once again, next to. But let's continue. The Yilame Tachton Me'elyon. What you're going to learn later, again, later means in verse 23, you're really learning from verse 21. Okay? So it's like this. Kamo olav hanemar lamalahu lashon etzel. Just like in verse 20, al means next to. So too here in verse 23, nemar lamata, what is said below, in 23, gam kein lashon etzel. And now we understand it better. V'smichut parshiot haboim lidei perazeh. The very fact that you have ve'el mishpatim next to a clear definition. What does al mean? Next to, like drill it in your head. Then you have the Sanhedrin, which is next to. We're trying to understand, why did Rashi only bring down one pshat and not the other 2 pshatim from the Gemara? Let's continue. So he says, Ki midaka'amar ve'elu mishpatim, from the very fact that our verse says, and these are the statutes or the laws, ordinances, with a vav. We saw the very first Rashi tonight, that va'ela means a continuation, in addition to what was already said. This also applies. He calls it a vav ituf. I never saw that phraseology used. If anybody wants to correct me, I believe that's vav hamachaber, right? Ituf means to envelope, which means to include. Okay, so that would make sense. Shma mina, what do we hear from this? What do we deduce? Shegam lamala niten ezachocha mishpat el hadayanim. That, what do we hear from this? That also what was said above. Since we have ve'ela mishpatim, this is referring to the judges, so too what was said before is referring to the mishpatim. You're giving a hok and mishpat to the. Remember, we thought it was only talking about the Kohanim. Now we understand how it works both ways. It's also referring to the dayanim, the judges. Lahorotam derech asher yelechu bo. This is teaching the judges how they should behave, which direction they should walk in, so to speak. V'olav amar, regarding it was said, v'ela, and these, which is shenoisef ala choka mishpat shenitein lehem lamala. That this is an addition regarding the laws and the statutes that you're giving to them above, which was in the previous, right, dealing with the Mizbech and the Kohanim, but now we understand it's also referring to the Dayanim. Tasim lifnehem gam ela mishpatim. These also must apply to those who you're putting these judgments in front of, who are the judges themselves. No. If that's the case, the Kli Yakar is still faced with a question. Im came kasha, then this is also a difficulty. Vehechan diber lamala min chukei hadayanim. Where is it ever mentioned earlier anything to do with laws referring to dayanim? We said it was only what? The Kohanim. Elevadai shamakum shasenhedrin hu etzel mizbeach. It's very clear now that it's certainly the very place the Sanhedrin sits is next to the Mizbeach, because the word al doesn't only mean upon the Mizbeach. In fact, we already saw that it can't mean upon the Mizbeach when it comes to slaughtering. So it can mean next to, and who sits next to the Mizbeach? None other than the Sanhedrin themselves. The Amar Lamalach, Lamala derech azhara la'oisam hayoshrim etzel Mizbeach. And now we understand how above, meaning in verse 23 as opposed to verse 1 of the next chapter, which is our chapter, that this is a derech azhara. This is coming as a what? As a command and a warning to those who are sitting next to the Mizbeach. What's the warning? Lo taleh b'malos al mizbachi. Do not ascend steps on my altar, meaning to say, etzel mizbeach, or etzel mizbachi, next to my altar, referring to the Sanhedrin. Okay, we have 3 more paragraphs to go, but this is worth it. Ubi mishma'ut zeh nichlechu bar kapara v'Rebbi Elazar. The inference, mashma'ut, what we understand from this, we can actually conclude what this difference of opinion is, how there is seemingly an argument between Bar Kapara and Rebbe Elazar. Kidat Bar Kapara lefaresh hamikra nosef al pshuto. We said Bar Kapara is actually doing what? A drasha. The drasha is to explain the verses additional to what is the pshat, because shenemar la'osen hayoshrim ala mizbeach, because then we're understanding that it's referring to those who are sitting next to the mizbeach, meaning to say etzel mizbeach. V'lo ta'aleh b'malos. Now the Torah verse says, don't ascend these steps. B'merutza, meaning quickly. That's what these steps represent, ascension. Lidun below mitun derek ge'a v'gaon. In other words, when someone does it quickly, it means that they're judging without deliberation or deliberately. They're not judging slowly, and therefore, what is that? That is gay. By the way, gay means pride. I hope that doesn't lose, right? Gay means pride in Hebrew. Ge'ah v'gaon, and exalted. After the very fact that you, the Sanhedrin, you judges, you're sitting next to my altar, etzel mizbechi, hamoira, ready for this? Drum roll, please. That it's kulo al geder anava. What is the mizbech? It's built from dirt, right? So therefore, it's teaching about the constant definition of humility. Remember, Adam is from the Adamah, and you must remember that. Hey mitzad shemizbeach Adamahu. One aspect how the mizbeach itself teaches us humility is because the altar itself is built from dirt, soil, earth. Hey mitzad shezivchei elokim me'ivin lidei ruach nishbara. And this is the second thing, especially according to the Ramban, explains all about these different sacrifices that we bring to Hashem, that the sin offerings and other offerings, we think to ourselves, well, this should be me. This should be me, right? Who's being slaughtered because of what I did. This brings someone with a ruach nishbara, a broken spirit. The humility, this will help you do tshuva, right? You want to do tshuva? Think about how, how lowly and disgraced you did something. So it's a ruach nishbar, and I'm going to take you to Psalms chapter 51:19. Okay, where is it on the sheet? It's number 11. The sacrifices of God. This is King David. The sacrifices of God, zivchei elokim, ruach nishbara, are a broken spirit. God doesn't want your your sacrifices. He wants your spirit. But he tells you, bring the sacrifices in order to break the heart. You will, right? And God, you will not despise a broken and crushed heart. Right? A leiv nishbar v'nitche elokim lo tiv zeh. Does not despise. Okay, that's very important. And the clear card goes on. Ein yale al libcha lihitnaheg begava ubegoda leva b'makom zeh. You don't expect people to act this way in the altar area, in the Beit HaMikdash. You come there with a contrite, meek spirit, right? It wouldn't go upon your heart to act with a haughtiness and with such greatness of heart in such a place. So the whole concept of the altar, Shekula Moire al Geder Anava, it's more of a question. It's more like a rhetorical question. So what did that mean? The entire altar really teaches us about how to be humble. Uperezehu derech durash. This would fit in with Bar Kapara of drush. Ki apshat midrash ein medabrim minyan echad. It's because they're not talking about the same thing. So Bar Kapara says it's a drush, not pshat. But Rabbi Elazar actually seems to say he holds by both. The Clear Card is saying no, he holds it's pshat and a drush. Al came bo Rabbi Elazar lefarize beofen shahidaresh v'hapshat medibrim me'inyan echad. Yes, the Clear Card is saying Rabbi Elazar holds of both, pshat and drush. And now he explains vidato lefarish, what he wants to explain, meaning according to the Clear Card, what Rabbi Elazar wants to explain. Sherotzo lahazir hadayan, that God wants to warn and command the judge, hayoshev etzel mizbeach, that judge who is sitting in the Sanhedrin next to the altar, velo taleh b'malos, do not go up these steps. What does that mean? Lipsoa psios derek gaos etzel mizbeach. Gasus. To trample, to walk on the heads, or even just to walk in a exalted, in a haughty fashion in the area of the Mizbeach. Since the Sanhedrin is sitting there, the judge is sitting there, the judge can hold anybody in contempt of court, so to speak. I mean, he's such power, unbelievable. He especially has to have a great amount of humility in the proximity of in the temple itself. Kisham Moshav Sanhedrin. That's exactly where the Sanhedrin is sitting. Ha'oile Shama b'malos. It's very easy to go up in ascensions or steps, and if you would go up there in steps, he would certainly be trampling on the heads of the holy people. Meaning to say, Al oisim shem roshim al am kodesh, on top of those heads of the holy people. Hainu Sanhedrin, that they would or possibly disgrace each other. You can't do that. Al ki al pshuto kasha. The Clear Card is still bothered, at least on a simple level. It's still difficult. Ki al harosh dafka lo yapsia. You can't walk on someone's body. So I mean, are we saying that? What does it mean on their heads? Does it mean on their heads specifically? Or al kol gufo mutter lipsi? What do you mean? Just on their heads you can't walk on, but your hands and the feet you can? Ela al rashay, the very fact is the heads, that's referring to Shem Roshim Am Kodesh. It's talking about the Sanhedrin, obviously, the heads. Below hasmichut hayiti omer. Now, if you did not have this proximity, the whole smichut, I might have said, and again, usually that means mistakenly, that the very verse lo taleh b'malos, don't go up the steps, ein bo ki'im pshuto. I would have thought this is only the pshat. Gam lo rotzo hamikra lismok al kal v'chomer shezacharashi, and also that there's no interest in the verse itself to connect to this kal v'chomer, like Rashi mentioned, if there was no smichut. Now, if that's the case, minayin ledayin lo yapsia. From where do we know that the judge themselves should not trample and that's from the Kal V'chomer. Kal V'chomer, let's just read it. Kal V'chomer ein lumod ki im shar adam. See, from the Kal V'chomer, we said that's referring to any human being shouldn't humiliate another human being, right? If you learn it from the rocks, that means any human being, not necessarily a dayan. Aval hadayan shemi yitalomar, but maybe the dayan will come to the wrong conclusion and make a mistake and think, hey, I'm so special. Gamani dayan kamoto umuter li lipsoalav. Certainly I can trample. Akein bo hasmichut. Therefore, this whole proximity is coming, levatel deyazu, to get rid of this mistaken concept that the dayan should not and may not disrespect and humiliate the people. Nimsa, so what comes out of it? Shebain, whether or not we talk about the words of Bar Kapara or Bain, the words of Rebbe Elazar, you learn that the makam, according to Rashi, the makam of the Sanhedrin is next to the Mizbeach, Al Kain, Perish Rashi, Oile Medivrei Shneim. That Rashi actually is incorporating these two opinions. That we said, how come he didn't mention Bar Kapara or Rebbe Elazar? Guess what? Within his structure, they're both relying on the smichut. And the smichut is to teach you about the Sanhedrin, going back and forth. Okay, now this is going to be very, very interesting. Yesh od ahazara be'inyan hamitun. We've discussed this idea of being slow in judgment. It's very important, not just for the judges, but also for ourselves in our own lives. Shelo yichtok din hadin mehera. Don't cut. It's interesting because, you're cutting a din, you're cutting a verdict. In Hebrew, to give a psak means to give a break. Like a period at the end of a sentence is called sof pasuk. A sentence is called a pasuk. Sof pasuk, we call it a psik. A period is called a psik, or a sof pasuk, a psik. It's so interesting that in English, the word sentence, and then the end of the sentence, and in when a judge hands down a sentence, he gives a psak. Okay, it's so many words are interrelated, and the Hebrew is just a beautiful language. So the word yichtok hadin, don't cut the judgment, which really means give the verdict quickly. Mitzad kabbalas eza shochad, from the aspect of receiving favor, here it means a bribe, right? By receiving a bribe. This is corruption at its best, right? There's all kinds of corruption going on in all the different systems, and our system says not allowed, okay? It's not allowed. So this idea of judging slowly is kind of the opposite. When you receive a bribe, then the verdict is cut quicker. How? Let me just read those words again. There's another warning here regarding being mitun. Mitun again means going slow. That you shouldn't quickly give a verdict from the aspect of receiving any kind of bribe, because the lashon of bribe is called shochad. Now, the Yakar is going to be bothered with the Gemara statement, but he's going to then agree with it at the end, but he holds quite differently. The word shochad, bribe, is going on the money, the envelope. That's called the bribe, as opposed to the people. I would use the verb. There was bribery, and he bribed him, or he was bribed by that person. But it's the money that's called the bribe. But in the beginning, we're going to see this Gemara in Kesubis 105. Do I have it on the sheet? It's actually number 12 on page 4. Rav has said, what is the reason for the prohibition against taking a bribe? I don't know why you need to explain it, but he says, once a judge accepts the bribe from one party, his thoughts drew closer to him, and he becomes like his own self, and meaning they become one, basically. And the person doesn't find any fault in himself. He doesn't see what he's doing wrong. The guilty party certainly thinks he didn't do anything wrong, or he wants to be shown that he didn't do anything wrong, so he'll bribe the judge, who will then think he's innocent, or let's say verbalize that he's innocent. So what is the meaning? The Gemara says, what is shochad? It means the shuchad, that they're one, that the judge and the litigant have one frame of mind. Okay? So going back to the Yakar, he's quoting this Gemara in Ketubos, that it's kihu nigzar min lashon shuchad, that the word shochad, which is the word in the Bible for bribery or bribe, is because shuchad, that he becomes one in mind, the judge with the litigant. Meaning to say, Rotzono Lamar, ki hanotnu v'mekablu nasuchad, that the one who gave, the criminal, and the one who received, the judge, they become one. Ki ishachad, like one person. That's the way the Gemara explains it. The Yakar says, Ein hadat nocha beperzeh. He's not happy with this explanation. The mind is not settled. It doesn't rest well with this explanation. And he tells you why. Kimilat shochad, because the very word bribe is koyal davar shel lukach. It's actually going on the envelope. It's going on the money. It's going on that which was taken. Kilo ala adam asher lokach. And it's not going on the actual people who are performing the giving and the taking. Now you'll see he'll come back to explain that that could work, but here's a different explanation which is absolutely fascinating, because it fits in well with the idea of mitun, going slow in judgment, versus once you take a bribe, that the judgment has already been made with the receiving of the envelope. Al Kainira Lefaresh, therefore it certainly seems that one can explain that the word shuhuchad, the way the Gemara explains that it's one, don't explain as one, but lashon chidud, sharpness, because we have a special verse, we have a certain verse, Proverbs 27:17, barzel bebarzel yochad, right? As iron sharpens iron. By the way, this is why you should have a chavruta. When you sit and learn, two Talmidei Chachamim are sitting and learning, they're sharpening each other. They're saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not how to read it. Or that's not pshat. And then prove it to me. And then you have to come back with a stronger argument until you both come to the ultimate truth. Right? You're talking about looking for the truth. You go into a Beit Midrash, it looks like there's a war going on. There's an argument. How these guys are all fighting with each other. No, they're best of friends and they're lovers. And they're going to come out hugging each other and saying, thank you for showing me the truth. I was wrong. Or I had a better way to... tweak it, to fix it, make more sense in my mind, because I was always bothered by it, but I had my own ego and I couldn't see it till you proved it to me. So, okay, so that's the idea. Barzel bebarzel yachad, iron against iron sharpens. That's true. That's what the yachad means. It means sharp. Kikol gemardin nikra beloshin chachamim chotechadin. And anytime a verdict is given, the language that Chazal uses, chotechadin, to cut the law, meaning to give the verdict. Umishu mitun bedin, and someone who is slow in giving the verdict, eno chotcho mehera, they're not cutting it so quickly. You ever try to cut a tomato with a very sharp knife? Wow! Psh, before you know it, the knife's already at the bottom, right, hitting the cutting board. But when you have a dull knife, it's not so sharp. You can go back and forth that tomato and it ain't moving for some reason. You can't penetrate the skin. It's not sharp. So he says like this. Someone who is slow in judgment, he's not cutting quickly. It's as if he's cutting with a knife that's not so sharp. Obviously they're not cutting quickly. But when the judge receives that envelope full of Benjamins, right, full of dollars or whatever, whatever currency, miyad naseh sakinu mechudad. It's immediately as if it was cut with a sharp knife. It's as if there is a sharp knife involved. And cutting through the judgment quickly. And once the judge is receiving any kind of envelope, it's just a waste of time. to be deliberate in judgment. What kind of deliberate in judgment? It's all just an act, right? You've already made your decision. He says you don't need, once you receive the envelope, you don't need to be slow in judgment in order to clarify to the truth, because you're not interested in the truth. You've already concluded in your mind to declare the person innocent who gave you the money. That's why the Yakar says that the money itself is called shochad. Shuhuchad, the money is the one that cuts the din. It's the money, it's the envelope that made the verdict. Ki hamamon mechudad v'choytech hadin mehera. Because the money itself is sharp. The money itself is what cut the din quickly. V'im nafshecha lomar lashon. Now he says he wants to go back to the Gemara, because the Gemara did say that it's referring to the minds of these two people. So if you want to say that the Lashon Chad is referring to the judge himself, so then you can explain it in the following way. Az Perusho. Mi shemekabel hadayan mizeh. So this judge, if he received the money, miyad naaseh hadin mechudad v'charif, then immediately the dayan he himself is sharp. Hayodea tekev lehechan adin nota, that he's the one who knows which way to cut the judgment, because he's received the money and he's biased, and there's no reason to delay or be matun. So it all fits in well. Now the next three lines will read like this. Davra acher, alternatively, kak nikra hamamon shochad. The Yakar really likes the idea that the money itself is called the bribe, shochad, shuchad. So we have a very special mission in Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, verse 11, that says like this: Cherev bo la'olam, tragedy. I mean, literally it means a sword. War. A sword comes to the world. Why would, let's say, tragedy, war, it could be anything. Cherev does not have to necessarily be, when it talks about tragedy come to the world. But let's just use literally, a sword will come to the world. For what? Inoi hadin val ivut hadin. Specifically for types of corruption or procrastination, corruption of justice. Okay? Inoi is like an affliction, and ivut is like crooked. So when the judges are not judging properly, we, God forbid, have it's a missed opportunity to make a real chazak in the land. This is where I'm going to get political. So basically, if we want to ensure a stay in the land, okay, and I heard it was unbelievable, Khomeini, or I don't know, one of these big Iranian dudes over there, an imam, said that, or maybe it was Nasrallah, that the very fact that Israel is having a conflict over the reform for judicial, he looks at it as a good thing, and that this will be the beginning of the disappearance of the Jewish people. This is something we say, that we have to get it right. We cannot have corruption. Corruption will lead to the downfall of the Jewish people in their land. The land has to have a proper system for us to survive here, for us to be blessed here. So that's this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. A sword comes to the world for the procrastination of justice, the corruption of justice, and because of those misinterpreting the Torah. So the Yakar finishes, Im kain ze hamamon chad kecherev, that the corruption of the shochad, of the bribery, let's just say the corruption, the money itself is sharp like a sword. The money itself is cutting through our society like a sharp sword. So, what do we need? Who am I? But I'll pontificate for just a minute that a self-serving court that is only taking their own kind, and we know what we're talking about here, of a certain political slant or an anti-religious, anti-God, anti-Torah slant is the worst thing for us. And therefore, reform is necessary. I think a majority of the Jews in Israel believe that. The question is how to go about doing it. And Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, that there will be some smart people involved in incremental, or it has to be revolutionary, but let's say incremental changes that will be more in line with the Torah. And Bezrat Hashem, as long as we're going in an ascension, slowly but surely in that direction, I have no doubt that we will be here forever. And unfortunately, hopefully it won't happen, God forbid, but it's a promise that if we have corrupt judges and the whole system is corrupt, this will not lead to anything good. So Bezrat Hashem, we should go in the positive direction, slowly, however slow that is, with intelligence, in the right direction of making sure that the Torah, that the secular Supreme Court adopts more and more of Torah law as we establish ourselves in the land of Israel. Bezrat Hashem, have a great week, a Shavua Tov, and a great life.